turning around to somebody incredibly important. As I talked about in our last segment, Dr. Miles Yu is an incredibly good friend of mine, really impressive background. He was a professor of military history and modern China at the U.S. Naval Academy, and incredibly important in the Trump administration. He was a senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on all things China. I mean, just a brilliant, brilliant man. Dr. Miles Yu, my friend, how are you? Good morning.
My friend Morgan, so nice to see you in this different kind of a platform.
Well, thank you so much. Listen, I want you to just start off with the audience because they don't know you yet. Tell them your story because I think your story, growing up in China and then later working, for the Secretary of State and for President Donald Trump is just such a classic American success story, and I love it. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you very much for those kind of words. My story actually, personally, of course, everybody has this personal story to tell. But in the larger sense, my story is part of the American story. I came here from China. I grew up in communist China. I came here during the Reagan years, the mid-1980s, and I got my terrific education in the American system. I deprogrammed myself from my upbringing. So I went to Swarthmore College, and then later went on to Berkeley in California, got my PhD, and I entered the Naval Academy, started teaching midshipmen who were really remarkable bunch of American defenders of our democracy. So I've been there since, and you mentioned that I was lucky enough to be able to advise our senior officials during the Trump administration on China. So that's basically my story in a very abbreviated way.
Well, it's a really important story, and I always tell everybody that, and I want you to explain a little bit of this, but I always tell everyone the very different approach that we took in the Trump administration towards the Chinese Communist Party was in large part, obviously, led by President Trump. President Trump in the 2015 campaign really, I think, woke up a new bipartisan consensus on really what the threat was from the Chinese Communist Party. You, of course, knew this all along because you grew up there, you knew them well. But Miles, can you explain to our audience the difference in how the Trump administration approached China versus how it was approached in the Obama administration and now in the Biden administration? Can you give us some context?
Yeah, I think the most important feature of the Trump approach to China is that we abandoned the traditional managerial approach to China. That is, we only care about how to manage the relationship smoothly without any accident. So that's a foreign policy. That's a very bureaucratic approach. So what Trump administration did was we evaluated the entire foundation of this relationship. So it's just a matter of management of this relationship. Is whether this relationship is based on sound foundation or not. We came to the conclusion, no, it's not. It's based on a lot of misconceptions, and it's based upon some very unrealistic assessment of China. So in other words, we completely overturned not only just the policy, the mechanisms of engaging China, but also the foundation, the concept, the policy background of China policy. So we designate, for example, China as the number one national security threat to the United States. That's one. Secondly, unlike the previous administration and the current administration, we abandoned the sort of relentless self-assessment, self-denunciation. In other words, we do not really focus on us, how better we can adjust our tone toward China. And we instead give the Chinese Communist Party the ultimate agency in deciding the nature and direction of this bilateral relationship. So China has to be held accountable. And thirdly, I think, which is also very important, that is the Trump administration basically emphasized the idea that China threat is not just to the United States. The China threat is to the world. So that's right. Why the current narrative from the left saying that we just we're like act like cowboy, we do not care about the foreign allies is completely untrue. You traveled with Secretary Pompeo, so did I, and he spent a lot of time sort of telling our friends and allies who were initially unwilling to take our line, and eventually we brought them along.
Yes.
This is a collective effort.
Well, you're listening to the Morgan Ortagus Show. We have my friend, Dr. Miles Yu, on, who was in the Trump administration, was a former senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. By the way, we will have on the show. He'll be coming up at the top of the noon hour. Miles and I work closely for the secretary. You know, one thing that I think is really important, because we all suffered so much from COVID. There was, billions of dollars lost. Our kids, and so many of us warned this at the time, but our kids are just left behind because some of them, like in Chicago, they were out of school 2 years. Ridiculous things that we did to our children in this country. But one of the things that I think is incredibly important, Miles, is that the Chinese Communist Party was never held accountable for COVID that they unleashed on the world. They destroyed the live virus samples, and they, to this day, we're at the end of 2023, they never allowed true independent investigators or scientists to go in to figure out what happened. They lied to the world, and they haven't been held accountable for it. One of the things I'd like you to describe, again, Dr. Miles Yu, former advisor to Mike Pompeo in the Trump administration on China. Miles, describe for everybody what you were seeing in really early days of COVID on Chinese language social media, all the stuff that they took down before the world. You were looking at that stuff. You were compiling this stuff. Tell us what China was actually up to in those early days of COVID.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier about the Trump approach to China. In the old days, when we deal with the Soviet Union, we say it's trust but verify. And Secretary Mike Pompeo, based on all this study of all the records, he came up with a new formula that is our approach to China should be distrust and verify. In other words, we start with China by default; they're lying. So, and we look at the COVID issue, for example, very early on, to see what China is trying to cover up. Based on all the open sources materials, Secretary Pompeo asked me to investigate it. It was so obvious. There was a mounting circumstantial evidence pointing to China's cover-up. So it all goes back to 2003. In 2003, some of you listeners may remember, I know it's a long time ago, there was an outbreak of SARS, S-A-R-S, in China. That was so mysterious, it's completely spooked the Chinese Communist Party leadership. They couldn't figure out exactly what happened. So the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, basically ordered a nationwide study of the SARS virus and order all of the biolabs to come up with some kind of a vaccine. So that's why they began a relentless collection and synthesizing these deadly viruses that could be found. And they put this into the Central Depository Institute called the Wuhan Institute of Biology in China. So that place has a lot of deadly viruses. So this brings up two problems. Number one is the biosafety. The biosafety mechanism in China is abysmal. It's terrible. Even Chinese experts were terribly worried about this. So this is basically the problem. And the second problem is that when this lethality of the viruses were revealed to the Chinese high command, the Chinese military jumped in and they want to make this a weapon, biological weapons. So in this Wuhan Institute of Virology, there was a lot of Chinese military involvement trying to weaponize these deadly viruses. But most importantly, in the process of doing all the things, finding vaccine and militarize these viruses, and in the meantime, there was a terrible biosafety standards and management, and that created the leak. And that's basically how this whole thing started. And Xi Jinping himself actually inadvertently admitted this is a problem. Biosafety is a problem. So that's
you're listening
how we
to.
found out.
Yeah, sorry, Miles. Go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Well, you're listening to Dr. Miles Yu. This is the Morgan Ortagus Show. I'm going to bring you stuff that you're not hearing every week. I'm going to bring you guests like Dr. Miles Yu, who was in the Trump administration, a senior advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who, by the way, is coming up on the show. And we were so dependent on Miles in the Trump administration because, as someone who grew up in China, who grew up under the Chinese Communist Party, he's telling you things right now that, listen, that Dr. Fauci and others should have been listening to in the early days of COVID about what the Chinese Communist Party was up to. You know, one of the things that Dr. Miles Yu also did for us in the Trump administration is he was looking at everything in Mandarin on the internet in the early days of COVID, and he was grabbing it and filing it away before the Chinese tried to scrub the internet. Because that's really, Miles Yu, that's really a lot of what the Chinese Communist Party does, right? Anytime, whether it's COVID or anything else that they're guilty of around the world, any kind of incident, they will try to cover up. They will never take responsibility, and they will try to lie to the world about what happened. Isn't that right?
That's absolutely correct. You mentioned about the Fauci and all the American part of the story, which is also a very big cautionary tale, because this kind of research, irresponsible collection, analyzing, and weaponization of viruses in China is completely unethical and immoral and illegal. So what happened is in the United States, a lot of projects particularly study gain of function and primates, human subject. You have to go through very, very tough regulatory vetting. So many people try to skip that kind of process. So China posed the greatest opportunity of moral corruption, ethical corruption to American research. That is, many people find the shortcut and go to China, including Dr. Fauci and his effort. We give China. So China now is willing to cooperate with this to research on something that's banned. Gain of function research was banned by the U.S. government. So they do that, and that's why we have also our responsibility to take into consideration too.
Well, thank you so much, Miles Yu. One of the things that you also do now is you're at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm actually on the board of your China Center there that you have with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and we're doing an event tomorrow. And by the way, this event, if you're in Washington, D.C., I got to fly from Nashville to D.C. to do this event. I'm happy to do so. But if you're in Washington, you can, of course, come to Hudson and attend this event. But more importantly, for all of you listening, you can watch this event live at the Hudson Institute. You can find it on my social media at Morgan Ortagus, on X, on Facebook, on Instagram. We will make sure to have the link there for all of you. But the event that Miles and I are participating in tomorrow is on the perils of corporate engagement, American corporate engagement with China. Miles Yu, can you give us, Miles Yu, of course, for those of you tuning in, former Trump administration official on China. Miles, can you give us a sense of what you're going to discuss tomorrow on this panel at the Hudson Institute?
This is a very major panel, and thank you very much for participating in the discussion on a very important part of the U.S.-China relationship, that is American corporate engagement with China and its concomitant perils. We say it's perils because it has come to the level of fundamentally affecting American national security. China targeted on the high-tech industries, and not just a matter of trade, not just a matter of economic lack of reciprocity, but also because there's a lot of national security concerns. So we're going to discuss some of the aspects of the perils of Americans' economic engagement with China and how to sort of find the right solution to engage China. And I was going to actually go back to a little bit of dial back a little bit, Morgan, if you permit.
Sure.
You asked me earlier about the difference of the Biden administration China policy. I think that they'll more or less follow what we have laid out for them to do. The fundamentals of our change. We designate China as the number one enemy. They agree. We designate China's human rights atrocities in Xinjiang as genocide. They agree.
Yes.
They're tough on Hong Kong. So that's right. But they have a major conceptual problem, strategic misunderstanding of this relationship. That is, two pillars of the Biden-China policy are competition, strict competition, and also avoid conflict. So
That's right. Yeah.
if you think carefully, there's actually contradictory. It's impossible because if you compete China rigorously,
Well, that's a great point.
It will lead to confrontation, and you cannot really say we have to avoid confrontation at any cost. So you have to be ready for confrontation.
Well, Miles, we are going to have to go to a commercial break. I'm going to have you back on. But what he was just saying right there, the Biden administration policy towards China, just to reiterate it, is that you're going to compete with China, but that you also at the same time don't want to have any conflict. You want to avoid conflict with them. And that's just those two themes that, Doctor, you just talked about don't match each other and probably make conflict more likely to happen, Miles, not less. Well, listen, we have to run to a commercial break. I'm going to have him back. That was Dr. Miles Yu, who was a senior Trump administration official advisor to Mike Pompeo, who will be back on the show soon.